Don't touch her again. The command rings out like a gunshot in the vaulted Roman penthouse. The maid stands centered in the room, her blue uniform sharp against the sunset bleeding through floor-to-ceiling windows. Her right hand is still buzzing, a dull, electric heat radiating from the palm she just used to strike a monster. She is breathing in shallow, jagged hitches. She isn't afraid of the woman sprawled on the marble at her feet, she is terrified of the threshold she just crossed. In the world of the De Luca family, a maid striking a fiancé isn't just a fireable offense, it is a death sentence. Isabella Moretti, the woman on the floor, is a masterpiece of expensive beauty. Her red silk dress pools around her like a fresh wound. She holds her cheek, her eyes wide not with the sting of the blow, but with the sheer, blinding outrage that a servant, a girl from the English countryside with dirt under her nails, just put a hand on a future De Luca queen. Behind the maid, the real power of the house sits in a high-tech wheelchair. Vivian De Luca, the 71-year-old matriarch, watches the scene with a chilling composure. Her glasses have been knocked to the floor, and her left cheek bears the fresh, crimson ghost of a handprint. The heavy oak doors swing open. Lorenzo De Luca walks in, his tailored suit casting a long, dark shadow across the polished floor. He stops. He sees his fiancée humiliated on the tiles, his maid standing defiant over her, and his paralyzed mother bearing a mark of violence. 3 people. 3 stories. 10 seconds to decide which one is true. If this story pulled you in for even a second, kindly support me with likes, comments and also subscribe. It means the world to me. 4 months ago, Clara Whitmore arrived at this estate with a single suitcase and the soft, steady voice of her grandmother echoing in her mind, "You have strong hands, Clara. Use them to hold people up." Today, she stopped holding back, and the hierarchy of the Roman underworld will never be the same. 4 months earlier, Clara stands at the service entrance of the De Luca villa. She is 27, her hair pulled back tight, wearing a uniform she pressed herself using a heated pot because the staff quarters weren't ready. The penthouse is a cathedral of marble and ego. Mrs. Rossi, the housekeeper, leads her toward the north wing. Signora Vivian was the heart of this family before the accident. She was a scholar of history. Now, she is difficult. My grandmother was a midwife for 50 years, Clara replies calmly. I'm used to difficulty. The room they enter is clinical but grand. A massive mahogany bookshelf guards the walls like soldiers. In the center sits Vivian. Her white hair is perfectly coiffed, but her eyes are like flint. You're the one from England? Vivian asks, her voice a low, raspy command. Tell me, why did you leave the Green Hills for a den of wolves? Wolves are predictable, ma'am, Clara says, meeting her gaze. It's the people who pretend to be sheep that you have to watch. A flicker of something, not quite a smile, but the space where a smile might live, appears on Vivian's face. You'll do. Clara starts that afternoon. Since she was a child, she has been the strength for those who couldn't stand. She knows the weight of a body, the patience of a slow meal, and the dignity of a clean dress. She didn't take this job for the Mafia paycheck, she took it because she knows what it means to care for a woman the world decided was already a ghost. By week 2, they have a rhythm. Keats and Shelley in the morning, Vivian corrects Clara's pronunciation of Dante in the afternoon. They argue about the fall of empires like 2 generals who have finally found an equal. It is during these hours that Clara begins to notice the small, silent cruelties of Isabella Moretti, the way that the perfect fiancé smiles for the cameras but lets the mask slip the moment the door closes. Clara begins to realize that in this house of marble, the most dangerous weapon isn't a gun, it's a whisper. Clara stepped out of the black car and into the oppressive heat of a Roman afternoon. The DeLuca estate was less of a home and more of a fortress of limestone and ancient ambition, its iron gates yawning open like the jaws of a predator. In her right hand, she carried a battered leather suitcase that held her life's few essentials, 3 changes of clothes, a book of English pastoral poetry, and a small, framed photograph of the woman who had made her. As she stood in the shadow of the massive portico, Clara felt the calloused skin of her own palms. They were the hands of a woman who had spent her youth in the damp fields of the English countryside, hands that had learned the weight of life before she was old enough to understand its cost. Her grandmother, a village midwife and healer, had lived by a single creed that she whispered into Clara's ear until it became a heartbeat: "You have strong hands, Clara." Most people use their strength to push others down or to grab what isn't theirs. You use yours to hold them up. The housekeeper, Mrs. Rossi, met her at the service entrance with a look that suggested she was measuring Clara for a coffin rather than a career. The matriarch is not a patient, Mrs. Rossi warned as they navigated hallways lined with marble that felt colder than winter rain. She is the sun of this family. But even the sun can go dark. They reached the north wing, where the air grew still and smelled faintly of expensive lilies and medicinal alcohol. Mrs. Rossi opened the double doors, and Clara saw her. Vivian DeLuca sat in a wheelchair that looked like a throne made of chrome and leather. She was a woman of 71, her hair a crown of silver, her face a map of 1,000 battles fought in the shadows of the Roman underworld. She was paralyzed from the waist down, a survivor of an accident that had claimed her husband and her mobility 3 years prior. Vivian didn't look at Clara, she looked through her. "They sent an English girl," the matriarch rasped, her voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over pavement. "Do you even know where you are, child? This isn't a manor house. This is a graveyard with a view." Clara didn't flinch. She set her suitcase down and walked toward the window, where the Roman skyline shimmered in the haze. "My grandmother taught me that a person isn't defined by where they sit, but by the dignity they keep while sitting there," Clara said softly. She turned back to Vivian, her gaze steady. "I'm not here for the view, Signora. I'm here because I was told you've spent 3 years being looked at, but no one has actually seen you." For the first time in years, Vivian DeLuca felt the air in the room shift. She looked at Clara's hands, broad, capable, and honest, and saw a strength that didn't come from a gun. "Show me," Vivian challenged. And in that moment, the first stone of a new foundation was laid. By the second week, the clinical silence of the north wing began to crack. The ritual was always the same. After the morning sponge bath and the dressing in silks that no one but Clara would see, they migrated to the library. It was a room that smelled of cedar and the heavy, sweet scent of old paper, a fortress of thought where Vivian had once reigned as a scholar of history before the accident compressed her world into the dimensions of a wheelchair. Clara began each session by reading from a weathered book of Keats she had brought from home, her English lilt acting as a soft counterpoint to the sharp, Roman shadows of the room. At first, Vivian listened with a stony indifference, her gaze fixed on the dust motes dancing in the light. But the silence broke during a passage of Ode to a Nightingale. "You're reading it like a prayer," Vivian interrupted, her voice raspy from years of being told to whisper. Keats wasn't praying. He was arguing with the inevitability of his own end. "Give it some teeth, child." Clara closed the book, her thumb marking the page. "Perhaps he was doing both, Signora. My grandmother used to say that some arguments are just prayers that refuse to be ignored." Vivian's eyebrow rose, a flicker of the commanding professor she had once been. "Then let us argue about Dante. If you are going to live in this house, you must understand that hell is not a pit, it is a bureaucracy of our own making." For the next 2 hours, the room filled with the rhythmic friction of two minds meeting as equals. Vivian corrected Clara's Italian vowels with a sharp, academic precision, her voice growing steadily stronger, losing the tremor of the forgotten. They fought over the structure of the Inferno and the tragedy of Beatrice, their debate becoming a bridge between the English countryside and the ruins of Rome. As Clara reached for a volume on the high shelf, she noticed Vivian watching her, not as an employer watching a servant, but as a reader watching a peer. The matriarch's hands, usually clenched tight in her lap, had relaxed. In the small space between an English woman's poetry and a Roman scholar's history, something was being built that had nothing to do with service and everything to do with survival. "You have a way of disagreeing that makes a person feel alive, Clara," Vivian said, her voice finally filling the room like a door being kicked open after 3 years of being locked in a closet. Clara smiled, adjusting the blanket on Vivian's lap. "It's hard to be a ghost, Signora, when someone is constantly shouting at you about the classics." The atmosphere in the north wing shifted the moment Isabella Moretti entered the room, as if the very air had been vacuumed of its warmth. She arrived like a curated storm, her arrival preceded by the sharp, rhythmic click of stilettos on marble, a sound that always seemed to make Vivian's hands tighten on the armrests of her wheelchair. Isabella was the kind of beautiful that felt expensive and engineered, every hair in place, her smile a masterpiece of porcelain perfection. "Vivian, darling," Isabella cooed, leaning down to press a dry, ghost-like kiss to the matriarch's cheek. "The house feels so much brighter today. And you must be the new girl." Clara stood by the window, her hands clasped behind her back. She watched the way Isabella's eyes moved. They didn't settle on Vivian with affection, but rather scanned the room like a landlord checking for property damage. To Lorenzo and the rest of the world, Isabella was the devoted fiancée, a saintly woman willing to marry into a family of shadows and care for a paralyzed mother-in-law. But Clara, trained by years of reading the subtle shifts in a patient's breathing, saw the choreography. Isabella's kindness was a performance for an audience that wasn't there. When she adjusted Vivian's silk shawl, she did it with a jagged efficiency that nearly pinched the skin. When she spoke of the upcoming wedding, her voice carried a melodic sweetness, but her eyes remained as cold and static as glass. She looked at Clara not as a human being, but as a piece of furniture that had been moved to the wrong corner of the room. "I hope the English girl is treating you with the respect you deserve, Vivian," Isabella said, her smile never reaching her eyes. "It's so hard to find good help these days who understand the delicate nature of this family." Clara caught a glimpse of Isabella's reflection in the library's glass cabinets. The moment Vivian turned her head to look at a book, the fiancé's smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated boredom and a flick of her wrist that suggested she was shaking off filth. It was a coldness reserved only for the invisible, the servants who were expected to see nothing and the woman in the chair who was expected to say nothing. Vivian remained silent, her jaw set in that familiar, hard line. She knew. Clara could see it in the way the matriarch's eyes darkened. The perfect Isabella was a predator in silk, waiting for the sun of the De Luca family to finally set so she could claim the darkness for herself. As Isabella swept out of the room, leaving a trail of heavy, suffocating perfume, Clara realized that the Roman penthouse wasn't just a graveyard, it was a hunting ground. The discovery happened on a Tuesday, during the quiet hour before the midday sun hit the library windows. Clara was helping Vivian transition from her morning gown into a structured silk blouse, a process that required a delicate coordination of strength and care. As Clara gently lifted Vivian's right arm to guide it through the sleeve, the lace of the undershirt fell back, exposing the pale, thin skin of the matriarch's bicep. There, stark against the ivory flesh, were 4 distinct, blooming shadows. They weren't the yellow-green of a stumble or the mottled patch of a fall. They were deep purple, spaced with a terrifying mathematical precision. Fingerprints. Clara's hands stilled, but her face remained a mask of professional calm. She didn't look up, but she felt Vivian's breathing hitch, the air catching in the older woman's throat like a trapped bird. In a house of secrets, silence was often the only armor available. "I moved the side table yesterday," Vivian said, her voice too thin, too rehearsed. "I must have bumped it when the wheels locked. I'm becoming clumsy in my old age, Clara." Clara ran her thumb just beside the marks, feeling the heat still radiating from the deep tissue. "My grandmother taught me the language of skin, Signora," Clara said softly, her voice steady but layered with a cold, growing iron. "A bump leaves a smudge. A fall leaves a graze. But this is a grab. This is someone trying to keep you still while they whisper things you aren't meant to repeat." Vivian turned her head away, staring at the mahogany bookshelf as if the spines of the books could offer protection. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Clara didn't push, she didn't need to. The fingerprints told the story of a hand that knew exactly where to squeeze so the marks would be hidden by silk and status. It was the signature of Isabella Moretti, a cruelty designed to be invisible to everyone but the victim and the person who had to wash her. Clara finished buttoning the blouse, her movements more deliberate than before. She adjusted the collar with a tenderness that felt like a vow. "In my village, when a predator starts circling the flock, we don't wait for it to bite," Clara whispered, finally meeting Vivian's flinty, frightened eyes. "We start building a stronger fence." Vivian's hand reached out, her fingers trembling as they gripped Clara's wrist. For the first time, the matriarch didn't look like a queen or a scholar, she looked like a woman realizing she was no longer alone in the dark. Clara squeezed back, her strong hands anchoring Vivian to the present. The shadow on the arm had changed everything. It was no longer just about poetry and Sunday roasts. It was about a war that had finally left a mark. The cruelty of the DeLuca estate didn't always scream, sometimes, it was as silent as a grave. Clara returned from her scheduled half-day break, her heart still heavy with the memory of the bruises she had seen earlier that week. She hurried to the north wing, expecting to find Vivian in the library or perhaps resting by the window with her poetry. Instead, when she pushed open the heavy oak doors, she was met with a sight that made the blood in her veins turn to ice. Vivian was in her wheelchair, but she wasn't at her desk or in the sun. She had been positioned in a narrow corner of the room, her chair pushed flush against the corner where two blank, white-painted walls met. There were no books within reach, no music playing, and no view of the Roman skyline. Just 5 inches of empty, stark white paint. Clara dropped her bag. The silence in the room was absolute, a suffocating vacuum. Vivian sat perfectly still, her hands resting limply in her lap. Her head was bowed, her posture suggesting a woman who had finally been broken by the sheer weight of isolation. "Signora." Clara's voice was a ragged whisper. Vivian didn't move at first. When she finally turned her head, her eyes were glazed, as if she had been staring into that white void for so long she had forgotten the world existed. She said, "I needed to reflect," Vivian rasped, her voice barely audible. "She moved me here at noon. She told the guards I was having an episode and wanted to be alone." Clara glanced at the clock. It was 5 in the evening. For 5 hours, the brilliant scholar, the woman who could quote Dante by heart, had been forced to count the imperfections in the plaster. It wasn't a bump or a grab this time. It was the systematic erasure of a human soul. Isabella hadn't used her hands, she had used the matriarch's own paralysis as a cage. Clara's jaw tightened, the muscles jumping beneath the skin. It was a slow, burning heat that started in her chest and moved to her hands, the hands her grandmother said were meant to hold people up. She felt the urge to roar, to break every piece of porcelain in this hollow, gilded penthouse. Instead, she walked over to the chair and gently, firmly, began to turn it back toward the light. She thinks because you cannot move your legs, she can move your mind, Clara said, her voice trembling with a controlled, terrifying fury. She knelt in front of Vivian, taking the older woman's cold hands in her own. But she forgot one thing, Signora. I am here now. And I don't mind the dark. I was raised in the English rain, and I know exactly how to find the sun. As Vivian's fingers tightened around Clara's, the maid looked toward the door. The time for poetry was over. The war had moved beyond the library. Clara waited for the heavy sound of the front door, the signal that the King of Rome had returned to his castle. She found Lorenzo de Luca in his private study, the room smelling of expensive tobacco and the cold, metallic scent of power. He was pouring a glass of amber liquid, his back to her, the weight of the family empire visible in the tension of his shoulders. "Sir," Clara said, her voice steady despite the frantic drumming of her heart. "I need to speak with you regarding your mother. It's about Isabella." Lorenzo turned, his dark eyes tired but sharp. Before he could speak, a soft, broken sob echoed from the doorway. Isabella appeared as if summoned by a script, her face a mask of perfectly calibrated grief. She didn't look like a predator, she looked like a victim who had finally reached her breaking point. "Oh, Lorenzo," Isabella whimpered, rushing to his side and burying her face in his chest. "I tried to tell you. I tried to be patient with her, but she's becoming delusional. She's filling Vivian's head with lies, telling her that I'm the reason for her pain." Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her. "That isn't true." "Sir, I found fingerprints on her arm. I found her pushed into a corner, staring at a blank wall for 5 hours. Isabella is..." "Enough." Lorenzo's voice was a low growl that vibrated in the small room. He looked at Clara, his expression hardening into the cold marble of a man who dealt in loyalties, not accusations. To him, Isabella was the woman who had stood by him during the family's darkest hour. Clara was a girl with a work visa and a suitcase. Isabella looked up, her eyes glistening with tears that fell right on schedule. "She's jealous, Lorenzo. She wants to be the only one Vivian trusts. She even threatened me in the library. I'm afraid for your mother's safety with someone so unstable." Lorenzo stepped toward Clara, his presence suffocating. The warmth he usually showed when discussing his mother's progress vanished. "You were hired to serve, not to stir the pot of a family you don't understand. Isabella is a Moretti. Her blood is woven into the history of this city. You are a guest in this house, and guests can be asked to leave." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a blade. "One more word against my fiancée, one more imaginary bruise, and I won't just fire you. I will have you escorted to the border and ensure you never set foot in Italy again. Do you understand?" Clara looked at Isabella, who was watching her over Lorenzo's shoulder. The tears were still there, but her lips were curved into a tiny, victorious smirk. Clara's hands, the ones meant to hold people up, clenched at her sides. She realized then that logic was a useless tool in a house built on blind devotion. She nodded once, her jaw tight, and backed out of the room. She was alone now. The bridge was burned, and the wolf was already inside the fold. The afternoon was silent, the kind of silence that precedes a tectonic shift. Clara was in the kitchenette preparing Vivian's tea when the sound of a sharp, stinging crack echoed from the library. It wasn't the sound of a book falling or a glass breaking, it was the sound of flesh meeting flesh. Clara moved before she could think. When she reached the threshold, the scene was scorched into her mind. Vivian's head was snapped to the side, her glasses skewed on the bridge of her nose, and a brilliant, angry red handprint was blooming across her pale cheek. Isabella stood over her, her chest heaving, her face twisted into something no longer human. In her hand, she clutched a heavy brass letter opener she had been using to threaten the matriarch. "You miserable, paralyzed old ghost," Isabella hissed, her voice vibrating with a jagged, uncontrolled rage. "You think you can still pull the strings? You're nothing but a burden Lorenzo is too sentimental to discard. I'll make sure you're rotting in a state-run ward before the wedding flowers wilt." Isabella raised her hand again, her fingers curled into a claw, ready to erase the last of Vivian's defiance. But she never landed the blow. Clara crossed the room in 3 strides. She didn't feel like a maid, and she didn't feel like a servant. She felt like the granddaughter of a woman who knew that sometimes, to hold someone up, you had to strike down the thing crushing them. The sound of Clara's palm hitting Isabella's face was louder than the first. It was a solid, heavy, open-palmed strike that sent the younger woman reeling backward until she collapsed onto the cold marble floor. The brass letter opener clattered away, spinning toward the shadows. Isabella sprawled there, her designer dress tangling around her legs, her hand flying to her cheek in absolute, stuttering shock. The silence that followed was deafening. "Don't touch her again," Clara said. Her voice wasn't a scream, it was a low, vibrating hum of absolute authority. Her right hand was still buzzing, her fingers slightly curled from the impact, but she didn't tremble. She stood centered, a blue-clad pillar of iron between the predator and the prey. "You have mistaken silence for weakness, Isabella. But in this room, you have no sin that I will not witness." Vivian looked up, her glasses falling completely to the floor. She looked at the red mark on her own face, then at the girl on the floor, and finally at Clara. For the first time in 3 years, the matriarch's eyes weren't filled with the history of the dead, but with the fire of the living. The heavy oak doors groaned open. Lorenzo stood in the frame, his silhouette dark against the hallway lights. He looked at his fiancée on the tiles, his maid standing tall, and his mother marked by violence. The 10-second clock had begun. Lorenzo De Luca did not scream. He did not call for the guards or drag Clara from the room. Instead, he looked at his mother's face, the red mark spreading like a confession, and then at Isabella, whose weeping had become a frantic, high-pitched aria of accusations. He looked at them with a terrifying, hollow neutrality that silenced the room more effectively than a shout. Without a word, he turned on his heel and retreated to his private study, the heavy doors clicking shut with a finality that felt like a gavel. Inside the dim, wood-paneled room, Lorenzo sat behind the monitor of his private server. This was the one system in the house Isabella didn't know existed, a high-resolution, unedited feed installed after his father's accident. He began to rewind. He didn't start with the slap, he started 4 months ago, on the day the English girl arrived. Hours bled into a singular, haunting montage. He watched, magnified and in high definition, as Isabella walked into his mother's room when the house was supposedly asleep. He saw her face transform into a mask of pure, reptilian malice. He watched her hide Vivian's heart medication behind a row of leather-bound books. He watched her lean down and whisper into the matriarch's ear, her lips brushing the skin, her eyes alight with the pleasure of seeing a powerful woman reduced to tears. He saw the grabs, the way Isabella would twist his mother's arm just enough to cause pain but not enough to leave a mark visible to a casual observer. Then, he watched Clara. He saw the moments he was never meant to see. He watched Clara spend 3 hours patiently untangling Vivian's hair, her hands moving with a reverence that made his own throat tighten. He watched the arguments over Dante, seeing his mother's eyes spark with a life he thought had been extinguished 3 years ago. He watched Clara bring in a tray of food that wasn't on the prescribed diet, the Sunday roast that made his mother smile for the first time since the crash. The contrast was blinding. One woman was systematically dismantling a soul, the other was painstakingly rebuilding it, brick by literal brick. He saw the 5 hours of white paint, watching his mother sit in that corner while Isabella laughed on her phone in the hallway. Finally, he watched the slap. He saw Isabella strike first. He saw the brass letter opener glinting in her hand. And then he saw Clara move. It wasn't an act of violence, it was an act of intervention. Lorenzo leaned back, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in his dark eyes. He had been a king who couldn't see the poison in his own well. He had threatened the only person who had actually been loyal to the DeLuca name. The silence in the study was broken only by the hum of the server, recording the truth that was about to burn his world down. He reached for the intercom, his voice a cold, dead iron. Bring them all to the Great Hall. Now. The Great Hall of the DeLuca estate was a cavern of shadows and ancient stone, illuminated by a single chandelier that hung like a frozen explosion of crystal. Lorenzo sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his face a mask of terrifying stillness. To his left, Isabella sat huddled in a cashmere shawl, her eyes darting like a trapped animal's, still clinging to the wreckage of her performance. Across from her, Vivian sat in her wheelchair, her back straighter than it had been in 3 years, with Clara standing just behind her shoulder, a silent, blue-clad sentinel. I have seen the truth, Lorenzo began, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. I have seen the darkness Isabella brought into this house under the guise of love. Isabella lunged forward, her voice a desperate shriek. Lorenzo, please. That footage is out of context. Your mother is sick, she's confused, she probably manipulated the maid. Enough, Vivian said. It wasn't a shout, but the word carried the weight of an iron gate slamming shut. Isabella froze. It was the professor's voice, the matriarch's voice, the one that had been compressed into a whisper for 3 years, now blooming into its full, regal power. Vivian reached out and adjusted her glasses, looking directly at the woman who had tried to erase her. You didn't just hide my medicine, Isabella, Vivian said, her voice steady and cold. You didn't just push me into corners. You grew arrogant. You thought because I couldn't walk, I couldn't hear. I heard you on the balcony 3 nights ago, talking to your brother. I heard you laughing about the brake lines on my husband's car. I heard you say that one accident wasn't enough to get what you wanted. The silence that followed was absolute. Isabella's face drained of color, turning the same shade as the marble floor. Lorenzo's gaze shifted to his fiancée, his eyes turning into twin voids of predatory intent. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was a strike against the very heart of the DeLuca dynasty. Guards, Lorenzo whispered. As the heavy doors opened and Isabella was led away, not to a hospital, but to the cold justice of the Roman underworld, the tension in the room finally broke. Lorenzo looked at his mother, seeing her for the first time in years. Then, his gaze moved to Clara. He looked at her hands, the hands that had held his mother up when he was too blind to see she was falling. He stood and walked to the empty chair beside his mother. He pulled it out, not for a Moretti, but for a girl from the English countryside. Sit, Lorenzo said, his voice softening. Not as a maid, Clara. Today, you sit at the table. A family is not made of blood and marble, but of those who stand when the world tries to push you down. Clara took her seat, her grandmother's book of poetry still tucked in her apron. The war was over. The house was no longer a graveyard, it was a home. Beside her, Vivian reached out and took Clara's hand, her grip strong, her voice finally, beautifully unsilenced. The screen fades to a soft amber light, the grand marble halls of the DeLuca estate replaced by a quiet, reflective space. The story of Clara and Vivian isn't just about a slap or a secret recording, it's about the invisible lines we draw between duty and humanity. Now, I want to step away from the script and talk to you. Clara Whitmore came to Rome with nothing but a suitcase and a set of values. She was an outsider in a world governed by blood and silence. When she saw Isabella striking a paralyzed woman, she didn't call the police. She didn't wait for Lorenzo. She acted. She delivered a correction that put her life, her visa, and her future at risk. In her shoes, what would your choice have been? Would you have stayed silent to protect your job, hoping someone else would eventually notice the bruises? Or would you have risked everything to defend someone who couldn't defend themselves? It's easy to say we'd be the hero when we're watching from the outside, but in the heat of a Roman penthouse, surrounded by the Mafia, the stakes are different. Think about Isabella for a moment. She wasn't just mean. She was a master of the choreographed smile, someone who performed kindness while practicing cruelty in the dark. We see people like this in our own lives sometimes, bosses, friends, or even family members who use their status to silence others. The most powerful moment in this story isn't the physical hit. It's when Lorenzo pulls out the chair for Clara and says, "Sit." He acknowledges that the person with the most integrity in the room wasn't the one with the noble bloodline, but the one with the dirty apron. So, here is my question for you. If you were Lorenzo, and you walked into that room to see your perfect fiancée on the floor and a maid standing over her, would you have given Clara those 10 seconds to tell her story? Or would you have let your bias decide the truth before a single word was spoken? And to all the Claras out there, those who use their strong hands to hold others up, remember, silence is a luxury the vulnerable cannot afford. What would you have done? Let's talk about it in the comments. Would you have struck Isabella, or would you have found another way to break the silence? Stay dangerous. Stay loved. And above all, stay true to the strength in your own hands. And please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to the channel. I love you all. Bye.